thank you for your patience. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Selim Ferruh Adalı to be part of our series today. And our series is Migration and Displacement, History, Stories, and Myth, which is part of our explorations here in Potsdam, supported by the DAAD, to set up a migration studies program. And one of the great joys is to be able to work with very different colleagues from around the world. And we here, I don't host it on my own, alongside with the wonderful admin team. We also have Filippo Carla Uhink and Marcia Schenk who are doing this. And this is also partly hosted by Roots at the University of Exeter. So just to say that the basic format will be about 45 minutes presentation, and that will be followed for about 30-minute discussions. And students will know that they're particularly encouraged to ask questions, which I also look forward to getting those that you may not have had a chance to ask to Selim. And some of you have sent in questions already, which is wonderful. So without further ado, I'm just going to briefly introduce Selim, who will be presenting on Were They Displaced? The Problem of Cimmerian Migration in Ancient History. And Selim is a historian of the ancient Near East and Eurasia, and he's professor of history and social sciences at the University of Ankara. His research focuses on the reception of foreign peoples and their histories in Mesopotamian literature. So this is probably one of the earliest historical contexts that we're going to get in this series, so that's very exciting. He's also interested in the intertextuality that connects the Near East with its neighboring regions, especially during the Bronze and Iron Ages. And he's author of a number of books and is also the editor of several volumes that relate to migration. One of his books is The Scourge of God, the Uman Manda and its significance in the first millennium BC. And he's also the editor of Eurasian Empires in Antiquity and the Early Middle Ages, and also another book, The Assyrians. His current work is a monograph on the Cimmerians in the Iron Age Anatolia, as well as co-authoring with Hyun Jin Kim the monograph Migrations from Ancient Italy and Early Medieval Inner Asia. And he's also the co-editor of Rethinking Antiquity Through Mobility, which is part of a team that we have together that we'll be producing for Routledge. So without further ado, Selim, thank you very much for your patience, and we look forward to your presentation.
Lena, thank you for the generous introduction. So I chose this particular title because of a reference in Herodotus' history. So the topic is about a particular people of the Eurasian steppes, known from cuneiform texts archived in the Assyrian Empire, especially in the 7th century BC, and the late 8th century BC, particular texts which refer to the Cimmerians. And there's also an ancient Greek tradition from 5th century BC onwards, which refers to the same people. And the Eurasian steppes is an area of the world from the ancient history perspective, if you look at it in terms of written texts, a lot of what is written about them is based on accounts by people who either have encountered them or have heard oral traditions about them, or maybe transmitted traditions by various means. And in especially Herodotus' account, this is in the Greek tradition, although technically it's not the earliest account, it is the one with a narrative of migration. So in that sense, it's important. And because ancient sources can be analyzed from a narrative perspective, so looking at the text, how it constructs events. And there, now I'd like to go to that reference. First, I'll go to that reference. Now, basically, Herodotus' writing has a sense of story collection and storytelling. So basically, he claims to have heard various accounts on a given topic. He recounts them. He may select the ones he recounts, but then he also mentions the one he is more inclined to. So he gives an account of how the Scythians, so basically a people who are inhabiting the Pontic steppes, so the northern Black Sea region, in the 5th century, and and he gives an account by people. Either he encounters perhaps in Halikarnassos in West Anatolia or in Greece, or perhaps he traveled to Tiras or a particular colony in the Black Sea shore. It's not clear whether Herodotus traveled or not. So in the discussions about Herodotus' historiography, there is some element of discussion about whether he actually went there or not. One of the conclusions made is that whether he did, so some aspects of his book, some people that have received an account by him, there is some more information, whereas others, there's relatively more superficial information. So it may be that he either had good informants about certain areas, he may have traveled some of them, or maybe he simply didn't. And maybe he just talked, for example, to different people. So we do know, for example, in ancient Athens, there's mention of the Scythian city police, or in theater plays and things. So it's not impossible that he encountered maybe Greek-speaking Scythians even in parts of the Aegean Sea, either in Greece or in Turkey, in those areas. So we won't be really concerned about the actual source of the information, but we will look at the narrative account in History's Book 4, chapter or section 11. And there we have an account of migration, which seems to, if one were to think about steppe history and compare with later medieval accounts, where we have various pastoralist confederacies, peoples invading a particular land and pushing out another peoples to maybe a more western part of the steppes, and people pushing each other in this way. We have such an account here in Herodotus 4:11. So usually when modern readers read this account, they will read it not only with what they assume Herodotus knew, or what they assumed the readership in Athens or somewhere else would read it in the 5th century, 4th century, 3rd century. Readers will bring in their assumptions as to how to read the text. This also holds for modern readers. And so when we look at the origins of inhabitation for the Scythians, we find mention of the Cimmerians. And so in this sense, so the claim is that when the Scythians came to the Pontic steppes, the Cimmerians had left, and that they had an internal conflict among themselves. And the story, if we think about it in terms of what we would how we would expect actual political events to unfold, it seems a bit odd that a particular geographical region was empty when another people comes in. So when the Scythians came, did they really come into an empty land? So what's behind this? So that's the reason I titled this talk, Were They Displaced? In the sense, were there some conflict whereby they left? Was this caused by the Scythians? Or is this a fictional account to rationalize the arrival of the Scythians, or at least and when we look at that in the 5th century, we have by that time a recognition of the Persian Empire in Greece, in ancient Greece, and the size of its empire and various lands it controlled. There is also an account of Darius, for example, launching a campaign against the Scythians in the Black Sea region. And that is important because we also have in the Persian texts references to the Saka people. And it is recognized by Greek authors that the Saka, especially Herodotus also mentions this, that the Saka are the same people mentioned as the Scythians by Greek tradition. Now Herodotus goes into some more specification as opposed to the wider use of the term Scythian in Greek literature. skutai, which tends to refer to pastoralist steppe community. So it seems to have grown into a general term as time unfolded in the classical era and onwards. On the other hand, it seems Herodotus has some awareness that this particular Scythian kingdom that he knows of has a remembered history going to campaigns in the Near East, for example, and in Anatolia. And Herodotus gives a name, which is Bartatua, so a name of a Scythian king. Now, from a comparative point of view, the name Bartatua, Herodotus mentions this as Prototies. In Assyrian texts, it's mentioned as Bartatua. And because of the phonetic similarity, it is assumed that this is an actual capturing of real events. So in the sense, like this is an actual king, actual Scythian king who interacted with the Assyrian Empire and was remembered later in Greek tradition and in the sources available to Herodotus. And Herodotus claims to have collected this from both Greek-speaking individuals in Scythia, especially around the colony of Tiras and these other areas, and also Scythians and Greek-speaking population. They both were apparently, if we believe Herodotus, were his informants. So then we have this narrative account of Cimmerians entering into internal conflict without Scythian involvement. And then it is said, I'm reading just the last thing here. So having made up their minds, the princes separated into two equal bands and fought each other until they were all killed by each other's hands. Then the Cimmerian people buried them by the Tiras River, where their tombs. Now, actually, it says maybe aphos here, and says it's more like burial, so which is interesting. Then, when Herodotus talks about Scythian burial traditions, and he gives a detailed account of this in Book 7, he uses aphai, the plurals, to talk about these burials in general. And so he claims that Cimmerian burials are still visible around the Dnieper river. So that's interesting. And then we have, it says that, and having buried them, the Cimmerians left the land, right? And the Scythians came and took possession of the country left empty. So this is interesting in the sense, since it's not really possible that they came to an empty land. So there are various options to look in terms of how we're going to investigate this. We have, let me get his name, Kozzoli, a classicist who wrote about this, and he argued that this was a sort of topos to try to explain and rationalize the existence of the Scythians there, and since they were seen as mobile peoples, that they somehow got there and they established a system, since there's also irrigation making Scythians and various types of peoples mentioned there. So Herodotus refers to multiple peoples and languages in the land of Scythia, so in the northern Pontic area. Okay, so that's one option, therefore, is that this is a fictional account. Now, the other thing is it could reflect a type of event which concerns some kind of migration in this region along the steppes. Now, how are we going to figure that out, though? That's the question, and that's the trail I want to try to follow in its own way. Now, we also have mention of the Cimmerians in the documents of the Assyrian Empire. So similar to the reference to, say, Bartatu and Prototies in Herodotus, there are certain Greek hymns, for example, which curse the Cimmerians and their leader Ligdamis for sacking the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. And we have several accounts preserved by Strabon and some other writers of earlier traditions, short poetic pieces and things like this. And we don't actually have that in Herodotus, which is interesting. So Herodotus just talks about this. And the way the Cimmerians are associated with the Black Sea region in later Greek tradition seems to be taken up together with the Homeric reference in the Odyssey to the demos of the Cimmerians. So in book 11, I think it was, in the Odyssey. So it's a land of fogs, and the unhappy demos of the Cimmerians lived there during the time of Homer, or at least, let's say, during the time of the Trojan War and the travels of Odysseus in his attempt to go back home. So basically then the Black Sea region had come to be associated with the Cimmerians in this way. The Assyrian texts are interesting because they are also going to give us some information about the Cimmerians. Now, one moment. This is less well organized than I thought, excuse me. I'll just have to go to the relevant part. Okay. So we have various attestations of the Cimmerians, and they're mentioned much more than the Scythians in Assyrian text, which is interesting if we think about the plentitude of mention in Greek tradition as opposed to this. Now we have in the late 8th century, during the time of Sargon II, we have espionage reports. So they don't directly get involved with the Cimmerians, but the Assyrians hear about their war against the Urartians. The Urartians, so Urartu is the Assyrian name and the traditional cuneiform name given to the kingdom of Bianili. Now, Bianili was a kingdom established in the 900s, and it continued until the mid-7th century BC. And it was based around what is today the city of Van. There's the citadel, the Bankası as it's called. And they're based there around Lake Van with its core area. The Urartian kingdom had expanded into parts of what is today Eastern Turkey and Western Iran and parts of Southern Caucasus. So they have quite a range, and there's actually Urartian inscriptions in these large areas to actually demonstrate that they went there and they inscribed their deeds in various parts of these areas I just mentioned. And it seems that the Urartians encountered the Cimmerians either in the Transcaucasian area or somewhere in Western Iran. There's a debate about this with people looking into this. And that there's actually a letter which says that between Gamir, so that land of the Cimmerians in the Assyrian terminology during the time of Sargon II, between Urartu and the land of the Cimmerians, there's a land called Guriania. Both in Urartian references, and we have actually two names which are similar. One is east of Lake Sevan, Guriani, and the other is Kurianini in around Lake Childer. So that's we can say Transcaucasian frontier, roughly speaking. So, and Strabo refers to the Guranians somewhere beyond Armenia and near Media. So that can be taken to mean Western Iran in terms of today's parameters. It's not 100% bulletproof interpretation of Strabo's reference, but I think it may refer to that. And there's, of course, and Manea is a region which then comes to play here in the sense that several different regions and districts between Lakes Urmia, Zeriba, and the Zagros Mountains were known as the region of Manea in Assyrian text. So we have then the Cimmerians defeating the Urartians wherever this exact place was. And later they launch a pillaging campaign. They go as far as the heartland of Urartu. And Assyrian texts claim that the Urartians suffered a terrible defeat, and several of their generals died, and so on. And there's actually letter fragments which seem to indicate that there may have been a revolt around this time. And the reigning Urartian king at this time passed away. Urartian chronology is quite difficult. So, but it may be that we're seeing the death of one of the Urartian kings, not directly at the hands of the Cimmerians, but with events around the same period, perhaps. Now, and after that, we have next mention of the Cimmerians in Assyrian texts takes place actually in relation to Central Anatolia, which is interesting. But before they are mentioned, there's another power, a mysterious figure of Gurdi, who's mentioned as the Culumian, so not the Cimmerian. So some of the literature considered him to be Cimmerian, but it's not clear if the Culumian ethnic descriptor correlates to the Cimmerians. So there's no evidence for that. Sargon II, the Assyrian king, is killed in battle in Central Anatolia. So that's not taken very well by the imperial successors. So they sort of have a more less active policy in Anatolia and Iran after a while, the Assyrian Empire. They follow the various events. And there is an entry by Stephanos of Byzantium for Siassos, for example. It's a settlement in Phrygia where Cimmerians are supposed to be dwelling and finding grain there. There's mention during the time of Esarhaddon, so that's Sennacherib's son. So that's the grandson of Sargon II. And so basically there's mentions of how the Cimmerians, some maybe mercenaries or peoples, are potential allies of the Phrygians or the Urartians. So after that military defeat back in Sargon II's day, such events unfolded. We don't know what they are. We have the Cimmerians present in Anatolia. And the Assyrians are asking in their oracle queries, for example, whether they would be allied with the Phrygians or the Urartians. Now, there's also another power in Central Anatolia next to the Cimmerians, and that is Mugallu, the king of Taba. And basically, Esarhaddon tries to take away the city of Melit from Mugallu and fails. But he doesn't launch a more aggressive campaign against Mugallu. We find in Greek tradition, it's around just before that time, but depending on which Greek chronographic tradition you go with, either a date around the time of Mugallu's success against Esarhaddon or slightly before, the Cimmerians sack Gordion. Now, this historical reference mentioned in several sources, in several Greek sources, was correlated with an archaeological layer of destruction in Gordion for around the 1700s BC. But later archaeometrical research and various radiocarbon dating, except a new research by the Gordion team, established that that particular layer of destruction was a century earlier. So it had nothing to do with the Cimmerians. So that being said, because initially an archaeological layer was associated with the event, once the layer was redated, that brought into question the nature of the Cimmerian sacking of Gordion, for example. Now we also have an Assyrian claim of victory against the Cimmerians in Kibistra. So that is modern-day Konya Ereğli. So that's the area adjacent to Plain Cilicia in the central Anatolian plain. And we have Assyrians mentioning the Scythians, King Bartatua, for example. But they're only active, according to Assyrian texts, in Western Iran or Transcaucasia, most likely Western Iran. So, but Herodotus claims, for example, that those who campaigned in Anatolia or those areas, then they went back to the Pontic steppes after their adventures, for example. So this kind of thing. So there may be creative ways to correlate these different traditions. But the problem is because there are several ways to correlate them and the evidence is not as detailed. And even if it was detailed, which detail do you trust and which do you not trust? So it's not all a matter of interpretation, but let's say it is a process of interpretation. And so we have this kind of dynamic, and this plentiful mention of the Cimmerians, I think, hits home the idea that they are an actual people. So they're not just a mythical people mentioned or at least received by Herodotus' sources. So that being said, then so if you look at the range of activity or Cimmerian activity in the late 8th and the first half of the 7th century BC, Lena, could you warn me if I am like 10 minutes or into my time so that I can wrap it up. I talk a lot about Cimmerians, sorry. Okay, so we have then we have the mention of Cimmerians in Eastern Anatolia, first in late 8th century. Then we have them mentioned in Central Anatolia. Now another mention comes towards the mid-7th century under King Ligdamis, and the Assyrian sources know him as Tugdamme, and he's known as Ligdamis in Greek sources, and he fights the Lydians, and that is known by both Assyrian and Greek sources. He sacks various cities in Ionia, and that's mentioned by Greek sources, but it's normal that it may not be mentioned in Assyrian sources. So we can, I think it's not sufficient to deny its historicity just because it's not mentioned in Assyrian sources at that stage, especially if you have King Gyges of Lydia fighting the Cimmerians, and this being mentioned by both the Assyrians and the Greek sources. And they both sources mentioned that the Cimmerians killed Gyges. So we have this, and we have an Assyrian reference which describes the Cimmerians as practicing political hegemony, military hegemony in their western frontier. So in the land of Amuru, the expression goes. And this seems to be a reference to Ligdamis's military campaigns and his ability to sack various places and control certain areas in Phrygia, Lydia, and Ionia, at least. And that's interesting. So that it may be that this is a continued political presence moving on in different periods. That's one option, interpretive option. And here's the interesting part. It could, however, be that some of these Cimmerians are coming from the Balkans in the later period, and others, maybe they were in Transcaucasia or Western Iran. So in the Assyrian text, we have mention of Cimmerians in Western Iran and Cimmerians in Central Anatolia. It's not clear if it's the same Cimmerians or if there are two different groups. For example, Ascol Ivanchik in his Le Cimmerian in 1997, he proposed that these could be two separate branches of Cimmerians, for the ones in Central Anatolia and the ones in Western Iran. So it's an interesting question. It could also be that the Assyrians are imagine their location in a place which allowed them access to both areas, but that's maybe a more difficult interpretation. Now, that being said, so how are we going to imagine these peoples? And if we look at, now, see, so this is the various correlations between Assyrian sources, and the Ligdamis dies around near Cilicia, according to Assyrian account, due to an illness, but according to Strabon sources, he was killed. But this is normal. If you look at, for example, the Huns, the death of Attila, you have different accounts of that too. So it's not a great hurdle in that sense. So we have, for example, I want to go to Persia here a bit, and later sources, which mention the Saka. Persia has a tradition of multilingualism, so they would employ scribes from different writing traditions, Aramaic, Elamite, Babylonian. In some contexts, we have mentioned of Saka in Old Persian, which are written out with a Babylonian ethnic term, and that term is Gimir, which means Cimmerian. That's interesting. Now, Cimmerians, the mentioned actually Saka there are probably not the Cimmerians, but this has excited interpreters, and there's two possible explanations. One is, so the Cimmerians and the Scythians are of similar background, so therefore these terms could interchange. Another explanation is that the Babylonian writing scribes used the term for pastoralist peoples, because the Saka are also pastoral. So just like the Greeks using Scythian as a general term for pastoralist nomads, maybe the Mesopotamian tradition is using the term Cimmerian for that. And maybe that began with their encounters with the Cimmerians during the time of the Assyrian Empire. Because scribes working for the Assyrian Empire were both Assyrian writing and Babylonian writing scribes. So this is not beyond possibility. Now, in terms of our account, if I may go back to that now. Okay. First, let me explain these charts here. So basically, from this, in terms of archaeologically tracing the Cimmerians and the Scythians, there is debate as to which material culture would relate to which peoples mentioned in historical texts. Of course, this seems to be a research question that's quite critical. But what if, after a while, it becomes hard to establish with 100% certainty which culture belongs to which? And this has to do with the fact that how the identification of pastoralist nomadic peoples in archaeology is dependent not on, for example, although there is pottery associated with some of their areas and stuff, but it's not identified, say, such as Lydians or the Phrygians or the Babylonians. So we don't have that kind of range of archaeological material, but there's a different range, and this has to do with obviously skeletal finds and dietary practices, things, these more up-to-date methods, things like that. There are burials, and the burials they have been discovered since the 17th century onwards. These first came to the recognition of German writing and Russian writing scholars, starting from the 17th century onwards. First, in terms of the golden items, various golden artifacts, especially something called as the Romanov Empire expanded into the Pacific shore, and they would have their province in Siberia, like from Tobolsk, the governor there would send the Tsar, especially Peter the Great, who would have visited, for example, the Ashmolean Museum of the time, which was opened just 15 years before his arrival into England. And my point is there. So basically, it all began with this recognition, especially with the unfolding of the kurgans, the burial sites in the Pontic Steppe region, in the Black Sea region, and those in Siberia. Eventually, there was a recognition of a Scythian Siberian animal style. So this kind of ornamental thing, which has similar animal motifs, this seems to have spread across the Eurasian steppes. And another thing is the range of weapons. So we have types of swords, axes, and arrowheads, which seems to be a common feature across the same steppe horizon. And so a lot of the research then started to look at the specific features of the weapons. So the typological, what we can call as the typological comparison. So this also became important, along with radiocarbon dating, or for example, various finds that could be found in the burials, the kurgans. Now the terminology for Eurasian burials became kurgans, whereas the burial mounds in Anatolia became the tumuli, the tumulus. And actually, the burial mound has some similarities just because of the nature of gravity and architecture. Now, the term kurgan is originally a Turkic term meaning like fortress, protectorate area, but it became an archaeological term for especially Scythian and Siberian burial finds across the Eurasian steppes. So, especially in the region of Tuva, once there were burial finds, Arzan first and Arzan the second, as they're called. One Arzan first from the 9th century, according to latest datings. There's some debate about the exact dating. Say, is it like early 8th century or is it second half of 9th century? This kind of thing. It's beyond my technical capability to judge that specifically, but that seems to be the number offered. And we have mid 7th century Arzansk, and the finds there are similar to a lot of the finds across the steppes. So that brings the difficulty of knowing, for example, imagining an event, for example, like Herodotus taught, people pushing each other across the Eurasian steppes, because they may be using similar material artifacts. So as they're doing this, it becomes difficult to trace who's a Cimmerian, who's a Scythian, since they would have had the same similar culture. But that's only one view, that they have exactly the same material culture. So I will talk about that a little bit as well. So here we have, for example, there's monumental art stylistic art, various things that, for example, in Mongolia, there are the deer stones, which also can be found as far as the Black Sea region. So a lot of this material culture, the earliest is from Siberia. So does that mean that it spread from Siberia to the Pontic areas in the Black Sea region? It probably is, but I would like to, so I'm going to offer a hypothesis at the end of my lecture. Okay. So
Selim, you
yes.
have about 12 minutes or so.
Thank you. Now, another account which I want to touch upon is Diodorus Siculus. Now, by this time, people are reading Herodotus, but they're also adding things. Especially, we have the Sarmatians who had already been entering into Scythian areas in the Black Sea region and replacing them as the pastoralist nomadic power, let's say, and as peoples there. And there are a lot of stories about them. The Sarmatians also connected with stories about the Amazons. So we have the Sarmatians mentioned, and first there are mention of the Scythians, their stories. So maybe it seems like types of things that Herodotus heard about, in slightly varied ways, and maybe since time has passed, they're slightly changing oral stories. These are less used, for example, in Scythology, and these are the areas. But in terms of thinking about them, if we can imagine if we use Herodotus, why can't we use this one as well? If we think about it, like, what's the difference in the sense? And there is a difference. Herodotus is older, and the names in Herodotus sometimes they have correlation with Assyrian texts, for example. So that could be one difference. So how do we know? Why do we use Herodotus more and use Diodorus Siculus less, for example? It has to do also with the general tendency about their details, about other accounts and other details of their histories. But my point here is also, I actually put a lot of things here, but maybe it was excessive. So basically, he has a version of the story of the Scythians, their origins and their source, but then there's the Sarmatians coming. And we have the Sakai mentioned, the Saka, not in the same manner, for example, but then we have the Masai Getae and the Arimaspi. And Arimaspi actually have this, they're supposed to be like cyclops, so it takes a lot of these what we call today, what we would call mythological elements. The farther away we go, the more supernatural and mythological it becomes. Now, and then we have the Sauromata mentioned in Herodotus as well, around the Caspian Sea region, but now they're closer by. And then we have a lot of mention of, after the Scythians, we have mentions of the Amazons a lot in Diodorus Siculus, which is what I wanted to point out. And this is the Termes River, or the Thermodon River from classical terminology. And in the Black Sea region, in parts of Anatolia, so we have this kind of claim that the Amazon people, or at least women warriors fighting, and so on. And there's a nice book, which at least I enjoy very much. It's by Adrian Mayer, The Amazons, but previous research by Jenny Davis Kimball. And we have this notion that the Sarmatians and certain Eurasian peoples, because they have men and women fighting alongside, and this is visible to, at least it circulates, these stories circulate, they transform into various fantastical stories in the Greco-Roman world, in the readership. And they're quite, because they create such opposition to expected roles of women, at least by certain authors that whose works have survived and in that particular system. So it seems quite different to them. So one view is that maybe the interaction, or the indirect or direct interaction with the Eurasian steppe peoples had this impact. So like Tomris, who fights Cyrus, for this kind of thing. In historical accounts, there is actually queens who take temporarily the king's place if the king dies in Eurasian history. So we do have such things. That doesn't mean that's exactly what happened in the events known to Greek sources. But my point is that, so this could be an interesting hypothesis, or at least part of it. So then we have, because these are all mentioned in Anatolia, I think it may have something to do with either the Scythians or the Cimmerians, or later Sarmatians, are people who either migrate there as mercenaries, or because of the political events, some of which we know from text and some which we don't. It could be that they're sort of reflecting on these. So I'm going to pass along these. Okay. Now, there's another approach that may be taken, and this article that I shared by Sergei Mahorty talks about this. So basically, what if, since we have evidence of pastoralist nomadic people before the Scythians in the Black Sea region, and we have similar horse gear, so they're not exactly Scythian, but there's still types of horse gear and arrowheads and things, which exist across Central Europe, and for example, the Caucasus. What if the migration that's mentioned by Herodotus, what if that refers to certain earlier events, certain earlier movements in the Eurasian steppelands? And that may take us to this idea that mobility, pastoral mobility, is recorded in the 9th century BC in Siberia, for example. But in terms of the use of the horse and mobility, the steppes have a very deeper prehistory. Now, in terms of the 12th and 10th centuries BC, we have various sites, and we have the decrease in settled agriculture due to climatic reasons. So he mentions this with references in his work. And then we have a proposed migration to different parts in the 10th and 9th centuries BC, so before recorded Scythian activity, or at least even archaeologically speaking. So that's another way of trying to look at, and that would mean trying to infer from various sites with horse riding technology, burials that are similar perhaps to the Scythian Siberian horizon, but not exactly the same, and try to think whether they could be Cimmerians. And that has a lot of reliance on Herodotus' account. Reliance on the Herodotus account in this sense has been a feature in trying to historically interpret archaeological evidence. The degree to which this can be done has also been critically assessed. So the question is, to what extent are we going to take this? But there's another way to look at it as well, and that has to do with assuming, okay, so if we look at the Eurasian steppe, so this is all from Barry Cunliffe's book, Birth of Eurasia. Barry Cunliffe also has a book on the Scythians with a nice, really good pages on the Cimmerians. Also in a book about the Celts. And so, okay, my point is, so we have Eurasia, which is connecting through the steppe, and after climate sets in and the grasslands become very suitable for feeding the horse and extensively growing herds, it can become the base of significant economic and military power, especially after the emergence of mobile horse riding. So not just wagons or chariots, but actually riding the horses systematically. And since we get that after a while in the 10th or 9th century, you could have a range of developments not captured in historical sources, but we can think about certain elements of them. So here are the basic roots that since the Assyrian Empire and Persian Empire, in world history perspective, they grow in intensity and size. And it's not just about China, or it's not just about Middle East or Europe, it's also the people in between who are benefiting from it and who are receiving a lot of interaction now. And we have, for example, various herding begins very early on in the Pontic steppes, for example. Even wheat, the cultivation of wheat travels in time across the Eurasian steppes, which is interesting. So it's not as if people carrying wheat migrated, right? So it's a form of mobility to do with technological transfer. So some people learn it, people next to them learn it, time progresses and it spreads. So we have also depend on the climate and conditions, and probably also the military capability of the people concerned, maybe, but that's hard to really prove. But anyways, So we have the spread of either agriculture or herding, depending on the time. We also have evidence of trade interactions. So the people, burials of Mycop, for example, has a lot of Near Eastern influence, even very early on in the early Cimmerian periods and afterwards, for example. Then we also have various ways of utilizing the steppe lands. First, horses domesticated similar to sheep and cattle. It's even eaten. But later people discover its capabilities for wagon carrying, chariot carrying, and in time also military or transfer. Okay, I'm fairly close. So then we have this long history. Chinese sources talk about migrations and people pushing again. I think they jointly mention these things. Herodotus mentions it, Cimmerian mentions it, and this has to do with the way of building a narrative about the mobility of the peoples, which does derive from facts, but it's not the only fact. The other thing is the spread of technology, and the other thing is also we don't have ethnic nation state at this time. So that's going to mean you can have a pastoralist ruling dynasty, but you can have people of different ethnic backgrounds forming the same political entity. The Cossacks are a good example of this, I think, in the sense, perhaps, like difficult understanding them. Herodotus talks about city burials. He also mentioned Cimmerian burials. So I think there's some assumption of similarity. And we have also from 570 BC, roughly, the Francois race, which refers to the person called Cimmerians, who is doing archery similar to the Scythians mentioned. So I think that the Cimmerians were pastoralist nomadic people with similar technological infrastructure to the Scythians. It's hard to trace exactly what happened, but at some place, at some time, they migrated into parts of Western Iran, later into Anatolia, and potentially into parts of Central Europe, but it's hard to know exactly who did what when, because of the dynamics that I mentioned. So this wasn't perhaps the climatic conclusion as certain with its results, but I hope it generates questions and discussions, and I hope it serves the purposes of the lecture series. So I will conclude here.